Thank you very much. Thank you. Great to be here to talk about the Terrace. I understand the news at the council meeting last night wasn't very good, but keep hope alive. I want to say a couple things about the Terrace, and also I have sort of a personal relationship with the Terrace because I grew up in North Minneapolis. And we, at a very early age, I made my first visit to the Terrace. I can't tell you how old I must have been, maybe 6 or 7, probably within a year or two of the time the Terrace opened. And it was kind of my first exposure to mid-century modern architecture because there wasn't much of it in North Minneapolis. And it was also kind of a magical place when you were a kid to go to the Terrace. Nobody can hear back there. How's this? Is that better? All right. Well, I'll keep it closer. So I have a personal connection to the Terrace and to Robbinsdale. I had many friends here. The important thing to remember about the Terrace is that it is not just another theater. It's probably one of the outstanding mid-century modern theaters in the United States. There weren't a huge number of mid-century modern theaters built because after World War II, the theater business the motion theater business was in kind of a state of alarm because television had come along. If you're my age, you remember getting that first television set and being transfixed by the Lone Ranger. And movie companies were trying to figure out ways to attract people to theaters. And one of them was, of course, Cinerama. We had the Cooper Theater out at St. Louis Park. But relatively few theaters were built in the years after World War II. What was mostly being built was outdoor theaters rather than buildings like the Terrace. And the Terrace was a hugely expensive theater for its time, extraordinarily well built, extraordinarily well designed by the team that was basically theater architecture in Minnesota. Liebenberg and Kaplan were the guys who designed theaters in Minnesota, really starting in the 1920s and going on up through the 1960s. And that happened because, for two reasons. Number one, Jack Liebenberg, who was the design guy in the duo, was extraordinarily talented. And number two, they were Jewish. And Jewish architects in Minneapolis in the 1920s and 1930s did not get jobs other than from other Jews. That's the way it worked in Minneapolis. So Liebenberg, many of the theater chains were owned by Jews. And if you look at Liebenberg and Kaplan's work, it's motion picture theaters, it's apartment buildings, it's houses, almost entirely, and synagogues, almost entirely for Jewish clientele. The good news is that, as I said, Jack Liebenberg was a genius. One of the great theater designers in the United States. This is the firm that invented stadium seating, among other things. They did many of the great Art Deco theaters, almost all the great Art Deco theaters from the 30s and 40s in Minnesota. And after World War II, they started doing theaters in what was called mid-century modernism. And since we're in Robbinsdale, where a whole lot of development took place after World War II in housing, in all sorts of building, in churches, this is one of the hot spots of mid-century modern architecture in the Twin Cities area, along with St. Louis Park and Edina and Golden Valley. That whole sort of tier of western suburbs is very strongly represented in the mid-century modern style. And there are only a small number of theaters built in the immediate years after World War II in the Twin Cities. Many of you have probably been to the Riverview in Minneapolis, which was Liebenberg and Kaplan's first post-World War II theater, and a very nice theater. They did a couple of others. There were a few other firms that did theaters in the 60s, like the Harmar, what was the one out in Bloomington? Southtown. But none of them compares even remotely to the Terrace. What made the Terrace, I think, so extraordinary was that lobby. It was the equivalent, the mid-century modern equivalent of the grand theater lobby of old. How many of you remember like the Radio City Theater in Minneapolis? Had the fabulous lobby. You think of theaters like the State and the Orpheum, they had these very ornate lobbies. That was a feature of the movie palaces of the 1920s. The Terrace was really an effort to create a modern movie palace. And the lobby of the Terrace, with its multiple levels, its fireplaces, its crying room for children, even its TV room, took this whole idea of what a theater lobby should be and updated it in a way that very few other theaters did, and on a very grand scale. And as a design, when I did my AIA guide to the Twin Cities some years back, I only included Minneapolis and St. Paul, but I made a few special efforts to sneak out into the suburbs just because there are certain buildings I wanted to include it, and the Terrace was one of them. I wanted to get the Terrace in there, so I kind of snuck it in, saying it was, well, it's close, you know, it's not far from Minneapolis. It is sad to think that the City Council perhaps doesn't recognize the value of the building. Unfortunately, this is an old story. I could spend hours talking to you about buildings in St. Paul and Minneapolis that people now wish they had not torn down, and there are a lot of them. But if you think of the most famous lost building in Minneapolis, which is probably the famous Metropolitan Building, which I was in as a kid, and which absolutely, positively should not have been torn down, and if it were standing today would be the #1 primo piece of real estate downtown for lawyers and everything else. The Terrace is Robbinsdale's absolute equivalent of that. There's no other building in Robbinsdale that is of that quality or of that architectural significance. And I'm not saying this to downgrade other buildings. There's plenty of fine buildings in Robbinsdale, some nice mid-century churches, some nice mid-century homes, all that sort of thing. But the Terrace really stands out as something special. And when it was built up on the hill with the big sign, it just sort of gave almost instant identity, I think, to Robbinsdale. It was like, this is our building. This is really something special for Robbinsdale. Its loss would be a great blow. I can't get into the debate about whether or not Robbinsdale needs another grocery store. I'm not that familiar with the whole background of the situation. But I can tell you, if the Terrace goes, regrets will inevitably follow, big regrets. And people will be asking 10 years from now and 20 years from now, and probably 100 years from now, why did you do this? Obviously, finding a new use for the theater has proved to be very difficult. And that's not unusual. Theaters are difficult buildings often to find a new use for a number of reasons. The Hollywood Theater over in Northeast Minneapolis, there's a group that's been working for years to save that building, and they managed to save it, but they still haven't really figured out exactly what to do with it. But other theaters have found new uses, big ones, small ones, in-between ones. We've seen the downtown theaters that have been reused primarily for live theater. We've seen smaller theaters used for all sorts of different kinds of programs. And I have to believe that somewhere out there, there's a program that would make sense for the Terrace. I don't know what it is. I can't claim to have any inside knowledge of what it might be, and I think David has spoken a little bit about that. But it remains a building with rich potential for reuse. And I think given enough time and enough willingness on the part of the community as a whole, a reuse could be found that would make sense for the building. It may be complicated, maybe as a theatrical space, maybe not. I don't know, but I think it could happen. and talking about the structure, theaters by code had to be built very well, because if you read about the 19th century history of the Twin Cities, they were always burning down with people in them. And as a result, the fire codes for theaters got to be pretty strict. And a building like the Terrace had to be built basically of concrete and steel and fireproof materials. And you're right, structurally, the roof could leak, whatever, but it's a very solid mid-century building. Will last for centuries if it's well maintained and kept up. So I don't think that's an issue. The issue, I think, is finding a use and trying to find a way maybe to buy some more time in the hopes that the city council and other leaders in the community will say, you know what, this really is something special. We have to really work at this more. I wrote a brief letter about my feelings about the theater, which David I think has sent on, and I can tell you that other architectural historians and other motion picture historians feel the same way, that the Terrace really is something far out of the ordinary as a theatrical building. It is our mid-century movie palace, and it's the only really true mid-century movie palace we have in Minnesota. So I would say try to keep at it, try to continue to persuade and argue and hope that you can find a way to make this happen. You will be doing God's work if you do, at least God's architectural work. I don't know about the rest of it. And you know, can make a difference for this community, I really think, to have that building still here. Once it's gone, it's gone. It'll never come back. I have nothing against Hy-Vee stores, but if it's like every other Hy-Vee store I've ever seen, it's basically disposable architecture. And we'll be here for 20 years, and then they'll say, well, it's another big box. What do we do with it? And you'll be sitting here 20 years from now wondering what to do with the Hy-Vee big box. And I don't think there's ever going to be a Hy-Vee preservation society devoted to saving. Although I used to joke to people that 100 years from now, maybe there'll be a Walmart preservation society trying to save old Walmart stores, but I kind of doubt it. So those are really my thoughts on it. I'm a big fan of the theater. I'm a big fan of mid-century modern architecture. I wrote a whole book about it in Minnesota, and gave great play to the Terrace because I consider it one of the really significant buildings of its time in Minnesota. Far more significant than any other theater, for sure. Really one of our great mid-century buildings, and let's hope we can hang on to it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know you probably are all familiar with the history of the building and all that sort of thing, and I'm not going to probably be able to tell you anything that David couldn't, but if you have any general questions you'd like to ask me, I would be happy to try to answer them. Yes?
I realize that go back to about 2008 when Congress really wrote this out, and the movie theaters in the late 90s, which was that too, was really mostly white code. But that notwithstanding, given the building that it is, why has, as a specific and in the theater trust, not ever, at least to my knowledge, taken one look at this building and the potential that it has, and certainly would have had much closer to the granted, it's not downtown,
right?
It's every bit of worthy of a structure as the other theaters that they operate.
Yeah, but although the other theaters that they operate, they were clearly looking at for live, among other things, for live performances. And those theaters, like the State and the Orpheum, were set up for live performances. They were vaudeville houses, and they had stages. In the case of the Orpheum, yeah. I mean, like one of the problems they've had with the Orpheum in St. Paul, trying to preserve that and get plays in there, is that the stage house isn't big enough, the backstage area isn't big enough, and because of where it sits, you can't enlarge it except by closing a street. The problem with the Terrace is that it was never designed for live performance. It was designed strictly as a movie theater. And so to make it usable as for live performances, obviously major renovations would have to be done. And you know, I think from what I understand, people have been open and willing to that. The theater is not if you can save it, it's not going to be saved in its exact form. Changes are going to have to be made for whatever new uses are provided. But I would hope that the lobby in particular, which is really the heart of the building, could get, although Liebenberg and Kaplan redid the lobby, they did it in '51 and they redid it in the '60s, which they did to a lot of their theaters, and I think the '51 was better than the '60s version. But one hopes that that lobby could be saved. What happens to the auditorium, which is subdivided already, et cetera, et cetera, that was really never the, I mean, that was the auditorium, that's where you saw the movies, but to me the Terrace experience was the lobby. I still remember, I always tell people, I had my first experience with a pop machine in the Terrace lobby as a kid, and my sister and I talk about this sometimes, and one of those machines where the little cup came down and you had the little liftable plastic thing, and then the water would come in on one side and the syrup on the other would pour down in there, and it was like, wow, this is really cool. This is really cool. When you're like 6 years old, it seems like a really cool thing. And I suspect a lot of people who went to the Terrace can remember, I can't remember specific movies that I saw there, but I'm sure many people can. But to me, it's always just the experience of being there, of being in that very special place. I've said that the lobby was sort of like a mid-century modern Rambler, enlarged to big scale. It had the feeling of kind of, that sort of a place with the fireplace, the classic fireplace, the smoking lounges, all that sort of thing. And that's why the theater is, as I said, so significant, because there just aren't very many theaters that attempted to remake the whole idea of a theater lobby for the modern era. And that's what really what made the Terrace so remarkable as a design, I think, and also just the quality of the auditorium itself, the way the seating was arranged, et cetera, was all part of it. So, yeah, for live theater, if that is in the works, I don't know why the Theater Trust, I suspect the Theater Trust has focused pretty much exclusively on downtown Minneapolis, and I agree. The way the world is moving and the way things are changing in Robbinsdale, and new restaurants coming in, new people coming in, it's not like it's out in the boonies, it isn't. It's a 15-minute ride from downtown. So, but maybe it doesn't quite have the cachet because it's in Robbinsdale and not on Hennepin Avenue. But I think any group that you could find that could be interested in doing it and doing the analysis and find a way to make it work financially, that's going to be the key, obviously. I just did a book on the Pioneer and Endicott buildings in downtown St. Paul that'll be out in the fall, and there are two buildings that started out as classic late 19th century office buildings that have now been completely rehabbed into housing. And it's really a remarkable transformation, but it works. The places are full because the spaces are so good that you can work around them and make something new out of that old space. Same with the Terrace. The spaces are so good, you have to believe that there's a way to make something new out of those spaces. I don't think we're ever going to see it back as any kind of a first-run movie theater or anything like that, although I don't know. Anything's possible. Yes, sir.
So I'm going to actually piggyback off of his, and this is kind of more as a procedural thing. It's like, so the State Historical Society, as David said, has given a $10,000 grant to help get it listed and everything.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sure the answer probably is money, but it's like, why don't they take a more proactive approach? I know they every so often release the 10 or 20 most endangered sites. It's like, to have like a fund that they can go and acquire it themselves, you know what I mean? And instead of waiting for some group to come to them asking for money, why don't they go and...
Yeah.
And you're right, you're exactly right. It's money. They don't have the kind of finances to do that. I mean, one of their big problems when people want to donate historic houses to them, they're kind of like, we've got some already, and they're hard to to maintain. They cost a lot of money, and that's going to be an issue with the Terrace. It's a big building. There, you know, the maintenance costs, all that, the remodeling costs. That's all a big deal. I know that they're in process of getting the Terrace on the National Register. I don't know if that's going to happen before or after whatever happens to the building, but even if it is put on the National Register tomorrow, that doesn't stop the city council or anybody from tearing it down, or the owners from tearing it down. It's just, it's an honorable title. If federal funds are involved in the process, then the National Park Service, but if it's not locally designated by the city, which is far more important than national designation, and as an historic building with historic guidelines, et cetera, it's not going to help. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if there's any comparison at all that could be made with what was done in Columbia Heights. With the Heights, smaller level, but maybe talk to those people, maybe they have some ideas or insights that might be helpful.
Yeah, the Heights is an interesting example of an older theater that, you know, has found a new life, but they're basically showing it as a movie theater. It's a, I think, a 1920, 1915 vintage building, somewhere in there. Much smaller. I don't know what the seating is. And I think part of the Terrace's problem is its size. It's actually it's turned out to be easier to save some of the smaller theaters than the big ones, like the Mounds Theater in St. Paul, which was sat vacant for years, got saved and reused for various community events and other things. The Ritz Theater over northeast Minneapolis, those were small neighborhood theaters that people could find a new use for. The Avalon in South Minneapolis, even the Franklin's still around. But the Terrace, its size is definitely part of the issue. It's a big, nobody builds 1,300 seat theaters, motion picture theaters anymore, at least not in this country. So you've got that issue, its location. It's a tough one. The Heights, I don't know. I don't know the history of that. I know some of the other ones, like the Hollywood, there's been a mix of public and private funding, and you know, there's funds floating around there. The Preservation Alliance of Minnesota, but most of the preservation organizations, including the Historical Society, aren't just flush with money that can go into something like. You need a developer to come in and, you know, raise money and do the money stack and get it all figured out and find a way to reuse it. And the developer's not going to do that, obviously, unless they think it's going to be a going deal. They do the numbers, and the numbers either tell them we can do this or we can't. And I'm not an expert on that, but that's usually what happens with historic buildings. There are, fortunately though, for example, when they did the Pioneer and Endicott, there are a lot of tax credits out there, state and federal, for historic buildings. Now the Terrace isn't on the register, or on the National Register, but it certainly is absolutely eligible, in my opinion. I think pretty much everybody else's, that it would pass with flying colors. So I think a developer could conceivably, with that designation, or just arguing that it's historic value, we might be eligible for those kind of programs. But you got to get somebody involved in it in the first place, and that's the trick. Yes, sir.
Kind of a design question. For the terrace lobby, had all these angled soaring windows and that. Was that sort of a common trend in mid-century architecture, that you're basically opening up to the outside?
Yes, very much so. In houses, in small commercial buildings. I don't know if you've ever seen the little Dairy Queen over in Roseville at Larpenteur and Lexington. And it's built like it reminds me of a little airport control tower, the windows thrust up and out. And that was very much a mid-century modern thing, conveying a sense of modernity, movement, space, openness. You see it in houses. I've seen houses with the slanted windows. Mid-century houses, especially high-style houses, tended to be very open arrangement of rooms, one space flowing into another, using the fireplace not as a wall but as a divider. All of that was part of the mid-century bag of tricks, and the Terrace is very much in that style, and you're right, the windows are a dead giveaway, even if you had no idea what vintage the building was. If you saw those windows, you know, and you knew anything a little bit about mid-century design, you'd say, oh, that's something from the 50s. You know, it's really a classic building of its time, and you know, these buildings are now all over 50 years old. They are genuine certified historic buildings, and unfortunately mid-century modern buildings don't get much respect for the most part. People don't think of them as being old. They think of Victorians as being old, and that's one reason why so many mid-century modern houses, including some really, really good ones, have been torn down. Lake Minnetonka is just built on the remains of mid-century houses that have been replaced by McMansions, and it happens all over, unfortunately. At the same time, there's a tremendous interest in mid-century design. Mid-century stores that specialize in mid-century furniture are popular now. There's a whole crowd of younger people who are buying mid-century houses because they're straightforward, they're not real big, they're kind of easy to maintain, and we're seeing revived interest in that. I get questions all the time from people, I'm doing my mid-century modern, you know, Rambler in Roseville, and how should I do it? And I always say, get some books, you know. But there's a real interest in the style and a growing appreciation for the style. So there is some public sentiment out there for it, but it's harder to get people to believe that a building from the 50s is somehow historically significant than it is a 19th century building that has, you know, all the Victorian goodies on it. And so that's one of the issues that mid-century buildings face. There are very few mid-century buildings on the National Register in Minnesota, which I think is a shame. And those that are like Frank Lloyd Wright houses, or something like Christ Lutheran Church, which is a National Historical Landmark in South Minneapolis, designed by one of the Saarinen, Elio and his son. So there have actually been, you know, the Terrace is in good company in the fact that it should have been put on the register long ago, in my opinion, by virtue of its quality and significance. But now we're kind of at the push comes to shove point here, and I don't know how that's going to all play out. But
One more design.
Yes.
This Sputnik style chandeliers in there.
Yeah.
Were those really? If those were there in 1951, isn't that
Pre-Sputnik, yeah.
Pre-Sputnik. I mean, is that really their intent when they built it, or was that just a design element?
no, I don't. Yeah, I don't. You know, there were all those crazy clocks with the Sputnik look to them, and it was a name that I think was applied later to a style that had already developed. The mid-century modern era was probably the great age of furniture design in American history. And you know, I mean, there was just really a tremendously creative period in furniture design and in everything from clocks and furnishings and tables and you name it, chairs. I mean, there's just a whole host of now famous iconic designs that came out of that period. So the Terrace is also a nicely, as built, was a very nicely furnished example of mid-century modernism, and the architects of the period wanted to create a whole effect. They wanted to do the furnishings. They wanted to create that whole feel and look of the space as they understood it. And the Terrace really did a good job of that. Yes.
Where is all that wonderful stuff that was in the Terrace, like the Sputnik chandeliers and all the copper fountains? I mean, has it been preserved or just disappeared?
I do not know. Maybe David, do you know?
The chandeliers are still there.
All right.
I believe the copper fountain has been removed.
By whom?
A previous owner, probably when they were looking at converting it into medical space. And I do know that the fireplace is also still there.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
But off topic, but kind of just for the positive or optimistic side. So in all your writing and, you know, overview study of architecture. What's a success story that you got? It's like you had one that's like, well, I don't think this one's going to be saved, and it was, or or what's the best savior that we've had in the Twin Cities area?
I wrote an entire book called Lost Twin Cities. There weren't a lot of success stories in that. Well, no, I mean, there have been success stories. Something like the Pioneer and Endicott, which were really kind of on their last legs. I mean, they were vacant buildings that no one knew what to do with. There have been plenty of, going back to Landmark Center in St. Paul, which really kind of started the modern era of historic preservation. That building came within literally a week of being torn down, and people rallied to save it. So there certainly have been success stories, but there have been failures too. So I mean, yes, ma'am.
A lot of times when you hear of buildings that are rehabbed, it's local, but smaller groups that preserve them.
Yeah.
Is there any type of larger developer that is, on a bigger scale that goes and redevelops the buildings and rehabs them, or is it mostly smaller groups that?
No, there are. I mean, there are, and I'm not an expert on the development community, but there are certainly developers in the Twin Cities who do a lot of work with historic buildings, such as Jim Stolpelstead in St. Paul, who has a big company who just took the old Federal Post Office building in St. Paul and turned it into apartments and condominiums and a hotel. Rich Packinen, who did the Pioneer and Endicott's, done a number of historic buildings in St. Paul, and I'm trying to think offhand of people in Minneapolis. I think the problem is some historic buildings are much easier to do than others. Think of all the warehouses in downtown Minneapolis that were sitting around in the 1970s, kind of being used, not nearly as full as it could be. Those buildings, because of the quality of their construction and because they were simple loft spaces, they're basically open floors with pillars, they lent themselves quite readily to offices, housing, you name it, restaurants. They were kind of big boxes, but big boxes built much better than the big boxes today. The Terrace is a specialty building. It was built to be a motion picture theater. It has that very large, very unusual lobby. It's kind of a special case, and so that type of a building is actually harder to find, I think, a new use for than a more generic kind of a warehouse building where there's 100 different things you can do with it. With the Terrace, you can't really see it being turned into housing. Doesn't seem to make any sense. Offices, not really, unless you maybe took the auditorium away and used a lot. It's a much more difficult proposition, and the theaters that have been preserved have been preserved primarily in the case of downtown Minneapolis for live theater, live events. Some of the smaller ones have been used as neighborhood spaces or found a specific company, ballet, a small acting company. They found some use that people could support them. The Terrace's size and the cost of renovating it are all difficult challenges, and I think that's one reason why it's sat vacant for so long. And in Robbinsdale, I mean, if it were sitting in downtown Minneapolis, and never would have been built there because it's a classic suburban design always. But if it were sitting in a block in downtown Minneapolis, I guarantee you it would have been preserved and somebody had found a use for it. I mean, I can guarantee you that. But people don't think of historic preservation in the suburbs, but they ought to start thinking about it because it's coming up for all the western first-tier suburbs. There's a lot of historic preservation that's going to happen, or they're going to lose a lot of their mid-century modern legacy. Yes, ma'am, you have a question.
Just to change the subject a little bit, because somebody posted it on our site this morning. The Guthrie, why did they not save it? What's going on there now?
The Guthrie wasn't saved because the two principal people who could have saved it, the owner, which was actually the Walker, and the user, which was actually the Guthrie, neither one of them wanted to stay in that building. And they didn't want to stay in that building because its backstage spaces were not at all good. And the Walker wanted that site for its sculpture garden, which it is now finally doing there. And the Guthrie wanted a new building. And if you have owners, you know, the problem you have is you have owners who aren't at all interested in saving a building, it gets much harder to save it. Unless, again, you find a new owner in form of a developer who sees the potential to do something and make some money. And that's where renovations have occurred. The guy who redid the Pioneer and Endicott said, I can turn these into apartments and I can make a buck. And I think he will. But all developers are gamblers. They're riverboat gamblers. And you know, no one's apparently yet willing to do that gamble with the Terrace.